What if the greatest act of American power in the 20th century wasn't a war, but a decision to rebuild former enemies? In 1947, the United States faced a choice that would define its legitimacy, its national strength, and the collective mindset of an entire continent. Spend billions to rebuild a shattered Europe, or retreat behind oceans and let history repeat itself. What followed was not just economic aid, it was an experiment in institutional integrity, moral choices, and the psychology of nations rising from crisis. When we look at Europe in 1947, we're not looking at a triumphant civilization. We're standing amid rubble, trauma, and exhaustion. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Rotterdam are physically broken. Railways are twisted. Factories are silent. Trade networks that once linked continents are severed. Hunger is widespread. Trust is scarce. And yet, beneath the ruins lies something even more fragile than infrastructure: legitimacy. Governments struggle to govern. Institutions lack credibility. Societal cohesion is fraying. The collective mindset of Europe is haunted by a single question: can modern civilization survive itself? This is where our journey begins, not with victory parades, but with moral uncertainty. Together, we're going to explore how the Marshall Plan emerged from this crisis, how it reshaped political psychology on both sides of the Atlantic, and how it quietly secured America's global power, not through conquest, but through rebuilding legitimacy and resilience. Because the Marshall Plan isn't just about money, it's about how nations rise from crisis, how institutions earn trust, and how moral choices echo across generations. Before we can understand the Marshall Plan, we have to understand what Europe had lost. For centuries, Europe had been the engine of global trade, architecture, and political innovation. Vast trade networks connected London to Bombay, Paris to Dakar. Architectural achievements, cathedrals, palaces, bridges, and ports weren't just symbols of wealth, they were expressions of institutional confidence. States believed in their own permanence. But two world wars shattered that belief. By 1945, Europe's social and political structures were hollowed out. Empires collapsed, monarchies fell, democracies were exhausted and discredited in the eyes of citizens who had watched them fail twice in a single generation. Communist movements surged, not just because of ideology, but because they promised order, dignity, and survival. Here's the uncomfortable truth we have to face together. Extremism doesn't rise in strong societies, it grows in institutional vacuum. When legitimacy collapses, people don't search for freedom, they search for certainty. Food shortages became political weapons. Inflation destroyed savings, eroding trust between citizens and governments. Black markets replaced formal economies. Even architecture told the story. Burned-out city centers stood as daily reminders that progress could be reversed. Europe wasn't just rebuilding roads, it needed to rebuild belief. And across the Atlantic, the United States was watching. In 1947, the United States stood at a crossroads in its own national psychology. America emerged from World War II economically dominant, industrially intact, and militarily unmatched. Its factories were humming, its institutions were stable, its confidence was high. Yet history offered a warning. After World War I, America had retreated inward, leaving Europe to collapse into depression, nationalism, and eventually fascism. So we have to ask, had America learned from its own past? Secretary of State George C. Marshall understood that this wasn't just a foreign policy decision, it was a moral one. In his famous Harvard speech, Marshall didn't frame the plan as charity or domination. He framed it as survival, of democracy, of markets, of legitimacy itself. The radical idea was this: national strength isn't proven by how much you can destroy, but by how much stability you can create. The Marshall Plan offered over $13 billion, an unprecedented sum, not as handouts, but as a framework for institutional rebuilding. European nations had to cooperate. They had to plan together. They had to restore trade networks rather than compete destructively. This was political psychology at work. Cooperation wasn't just encouraged, it was required. And here's the counterintuitive insight. By giving Europe agency, America gained influence. By insisting on institutional integrity abroad, the United States reinforced its own legitimacy at home and globally. Power rooted in trust lasts longer than power rooted in fear. Let's slow down here, because this is where the Marshall Plan becomes truly transformative. The funds rebuilt ports, railways, factories, and power stations, but those were only the visible outcomes. The deeper impact was psychological and institutional. Trade networks were restored, reconnecting Europe to global markets and to itself. Steel flowed again, coal powered factories, food stabilized societies, and as material scarcity eased, something remarkable happened. Extremism lost its grip. Democratic governments regained credibility, not because they promised utopia, but because they delivered normalcy. Wages stabilized, savings mattered again, elections began to feel meaningful. Architecture followed psychology. Reconstructed city centers weren't just functional, they were symbolic. They said, "We believe in the future enough to build for it." The Marshall Plan also quietly reshaped Europe's political structure. Cooperation between France and Germany, historical enemies, became thinkable. Shared economic interests softened old identities rooted in resentment. This is how societal cohesion is rebuilt, not through speeches, but through systems that reward cooperation over conflict. And from America's perspective, something extraordinary was happening. Without occupying governments or imposing ideology by force, the United States was shaping a world aligned with its values: markets, democracy, institutional resilience. This wasn't imperial control, it was legitimacy through leadership. By the early 1950s, Europe was no longer on the brink of collapse. Growth returned, confidence followed, and the Cold War took shape in a very different world than it might have otherwise. The Marshall Plan had drawn a clear line, not just geographically, but psychologically. Western Europe identified its future with democratic institutions and collective recovery. Eastern Europe, denied participation under Soviet pressure, followed a different path. Here's the deeper lesson we have to confront together. Global power isn't seized, it's cultivated. America's rise as a superpower wasn't inevitable. It was constructed through moral choices that reinforced legitimacy. By investing in others' recovery, America created allies, markets, and trust that amplified its influence for decades.
NATO, the European Union, and the post-war international order didn't emerge in a vacuum. They grew from the institutional soil the Marshall Plan enriched. And yet, this legacy is fragile. Because the Marshall Plan also set expectations that strong nations would act responsibly, that institutions would protect dignity, that recovery would be shared. When those expectations aren't met, legitimacy erodes again. The plan reminds us that resilience isn't permanent. It's maintained through continuous ethical commitment. As we step back, the Marshall Plan forces us to rethink what national strength truly means. It tells us that legitimacy is earned, not assumed, that institutional integrity matters as much as military power, that societies rise from crisis not through dominance, but through cohesion and trust. Europe's recovery wasn't inevitable. America's leadership wasn't guaranteed. Both were choices, made under pressure, shaped by memory, and guided by an understanding of political psychology. And here's the quiet question the Marshall Plan leaves us with today. In moments of global crisis, do we retreat into fear, or do we rebuild the systems that allow dignity, cooperation, and resilience to return? Because history doesn't just record what nations did, It reveals who they believed themselves to be, and perhaps who they still aspire to become. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think legitimacy is built or lost in today's world?